The mud of St. Arasmus village had turned the color of dried blood weeks before the mendicants arrived. Shell craters pocked the earth like festering wounds, each one filled with rainwater that reflected the smoke-choked sky. The war had passed through this place like a fever, leaving behind broken walls, scattered bones, and the persistent smell of rotting flesh that no amount of lime could mask. Brother Matthias limped between the wounded, his plague mask catching the weak afternoon light. The leather beak, stuffed with aromatic herbs that had long since lost their power, bobbed with each labored step. Behind him, 17 more figures moved through the devastation, their identical masks turning this way and that as they surveyed the carnage with the measured patience of carrion birds. The villagers had stopped screaming 3 days ago. Now they only whimpered, a sound that mixed with the distant rumble of artillery and the creak of the great bell wagon that dominated the village square. The wagon rose 12 feet into the air, its iron wheels half buried in the soft earth. Brass tubes snaked along its sides like metal intestines, and from its peak hung a bell the size of a wine barrel, green with verdigris and inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "We bring the mercy of the Iron Saints," Brother Matthias announced, his voice muffled by the mask but carrying clearly across the ruined square. "Those who suffer in flesh may find peace in metal." A woman crawled toward him, her legs ending in bloody stumps where shrapnel had taken them. Her eyes held the particular desperation of someone who had already accepted death but could not quite embrace it. She reached out with fingers that trembled like autumn leaves. "Please," she whispered. "My children." Brother Matthias knelt beside her, his gloved hands surprisingly gentle as they examined her wounds. The flesh had begun to blacken at the edges, and the sweet stench of gangrene filled the air between them. From within his robes, he produced a thin iron plate, no larger than a playing card but etched with delicate spirals that seemed to move when glimpsed from the corner of the eye. "The iron remembers what flesh forgets," he murmured, pressing the plate against her ruined legs. "It does not tire, it does not weaken, it does not die." The woman's scream was brief, sharp, and then replaced by something that might have been relief. The iron plate sank into her flesh with a wet sucking sound, and where it touched, the bleeding stopped. More than stopped, the blackened tissue began to change, taking on a metallic sheen that spread outward like frost on a window. Other mendicants had begun their work throughout the village. They moved with practiced efficiency, carrying steaming cauldrons that filled the air with the scent of herbs and something else, something that made the stomach clench with involuntary hunger. The soup they ladled into cracked bowls was thin and gray, but those who drank it found their pain ebbing away like a tide. Young Petra watched from the shadow of a collapsed church wall, her arm hanging useless at her side where a rifle bullet had shattered the bone. She had seen 12 summers, enough to know that miracles always came with a price, but the agony that shot through her shoulder with every heartbeat made such wisdom feel like a luxury she could not afford. The mendicant who approached her was smaller than the others, moving with a gait that suggested youth beneath the concealing robes. The mask turned toward her with the blank attention of a scarecrow, and from beneath it came a voice like wind through dry leaves. "Drink, child. Let the iron remember what your bones have forgotten." The soup was warm, and it tasted of copper and sage. Petra felt the pain recede almost immediately, replaced by a strange tingling sensation that began in her stomach and spread outward through her limbs. When she looked down at her shattered arm, she could see thin lines of silver threading through her skin like veins, connecting to a small iron plate that had somehow appeared on her shoulder. "What is this?" she asked, but the mendicant had already moved on to the next sufferer. As evening fell, the great bell began to toll. Its voice was deep and resonant, seeming to vibrate not just through the air but through the very bones of those who heard it. With each peal, the iron plates grafted into the villagers' flesh grew slightly warmer, and their bearers found themselves turning toward the sound with expressions of peaceful attention. The woman with the ruined legs was the first to move. Her stumps had been entirely replaced now by gleaming metal appendages that clicked against the cobblestones as she walked. Her movements were fluid, perfect, without the slight irregularities that marked natural human gait. She walked directly to the bell wagon and knelt before it, her metal legs folding with mechanical precision. Others followed. The baker, whose hands had been burned to the bone, now sported fingers of articulated steel that gleamed in the firelight. The priest, whose jaw had been torn away by shrapnel, spoke prayers through a grill of iron teeth. One by one, they made their way to the wagon, kneeling in neat rows like a congregation of the devout. Petra found herself standing despite not remembering the decision to do so. Her arm moved normally now, better than normally. There was no tremor, no weakness, no uncertainty in its motion. When she flexed her fingers, she could feel mechanisms clicking into place beneath her skin, precise and efficient. The sensation should have been horrifying, but instead it filled her with a calm satisfaction that was almost narcotic in its intensity. "The iron does not forget," Brother Matthias intoned from atop the wagon. "The iron does not fear. The iron does not doubt." The assembled villagers repeated his words in perfect unison, their voices blending into a single tone that resonated with the bell's deep voice. Petra heard her own voice among them and felt no surprise, only rightness. This was how things should be. This was how things had always been meant to be. Through the night, the mendicants worked. They brought forth more plates, more cauldrons, more of the thin gray soup that tasted of metal and herbs. Those who had been healed earlier watched with placid attention as their neighbors underwent their own transformations. There was no horror in their faces, no recognition of wrongness, only the patient satisfaction of those who had found their proper place in the order of things. By dawn, half the village bore iron plates grafted into their flesh. The lucky ones had received only small pieces, thin wafers that nestled against their skin like metallic birthmarks. Others, those whose injuries had been more severe, carried larger sections, whole limbs or portions of their torsos replaced by gleaming metal that moved with inhuman grace. The bell continued to toll, and with each note, the transformed villagers felt their old selves fading a little more. Memories became fuzzy, unimportant. Pain was a distant concept, as foreign as the idea of flight. They were becoming something new, something better, something that would never again know the weakness of flesh. Brother Matthias descended from the wagon as the sun crested the horizon, his masked face turning to survey his work. Where once there had been a village full of wounded, dying people, now there stood neat ranks of the redeemed. They moved in perfect synchronization, their breathing coordinated, their heartbeats falling into rhythm with the great bell's voice. "Tomorrow," he announced, "we travel to the next village, and you, the Blessed of Iron, shall help us bring salvation to your neighbors." The transformed villagers nodded as one, their metal parts catching the morning light. They felt no fear at the prospect of leaving their homes, no attachment to the place where they had been born and raised. Those concerns belonged to their former selves, the weak things of flesh and blood that they had once been. Now they were something greater, something eternal, something that served a purpose beyond the petty needs of individual existence. Petra looked down at her arm, watching the silver veins pulse beneath her skin in time with the bell. She tried to remember what it had felt like to be afraid, to be hurt, to be alone. The memories were there, but they seemed to belong to someone else, a distant relative whose concerns no longer mattered. She was part of something larger now, part of the Iron Brotherhood that would spread across the world, bringing peace to all who suffered in flesh. The mendicants began to break camp, folding their equipment with the same mechanical precision that their converts displayed. The cauldrons were emptied and cleaned, the last of the gray soup poured reverently onto the blood-stained earth. The iron plates that remained unused were carefully wrapped in silk and stored in lead-lined boxes, ready for the next village, the next group of sufferers who would be blessed with transformation. As the sun climbed higher, painting the smoke-filled sky the color of old brass, the procession began to move. The great bell wagon rolled forward on its massive wheels, leaving deep ruts in the soft earth. Behind it walked the mendicants, their masked faces turned forward with unwavering purpose. and behind them came their converts, the iron-blessed villagers who had traded their humanity for something that would never know pain, never know fear, never know the terrible isolation of individual thought. The sound of their footsteps was like clockwork, perfectly timed, perfectly coordinated. They walked without fatigue, without doubt, without the chaos of human emotion. They were the future, the evolution of mankind into something pure and perfect and utterly without soul. The road stretched before them, winding through devastated countryside toward the next settlement, the next group of wounded who would be offered the gift of transformation. The war had left plenty of candidates, broken people who would welcome any relief from their suffering, no matter the cost. Brother Matthias consulted a map marked with small iron pins, each one indicating a village or town that had been visited by the artillery that would be ready for salvation. There were dozens of them, hundreds, spreading out like a web across the war-torn landscape. Each one would contribute its own converts to the growing army of the Iron Blessed, until the entire world knew the peace that came with abandoning the weakness of flesh. The bell tolled again, its voice carrying across the empty fields, calling to all who might hear it. Somewhere in the distance, in villages not yet touched by the mendicant's mercy, people paused in their suffering and turned toward the sound. They did not yet understand what it meant, but they would learn. They would all learn, in time. The procession moved on, leaving behind a village that was no longer quite a village, populated by things that were no longer quite human. The abandoned houses stood empty, their doors hanging open like mouths frozen in silent screams. But the silence was broken only by the retreating sound of the bell, growing fainter but never quite disappearing. A promise of transformation that would echo across the world until every last pocket of humanity had been blessed with the gift of iron. In the ruins of the church, a single rat emerged from hiding, its nose twitching as it investigated the strange new scents that filled the air. It found a puddle of the gray soup that had spilled from one of the cauldrons, and hunger drove it to lap at the metallic liquid. For a moment, nothing happened. Then thin lines of silver began to spread through its fur, and its eyes took on the same placid expression that had marked the transformed villagers. The rat sat back on its haunches and began to clean itself with mechanical precision, its movements losing the nervous energy that had marked its species for millions of years. It was no longer quite a rat, just as the villagers were no longer quite human. It was something new, something better. Something that served the Iron Brotherhood's grand design. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of metal and herbs, and in the distance, the sound of the bell continued its patient tolling, calling all who heard it to come and be transformed, to join the ranks of the Iron Blessed and leave behind forever the terrible burden of being truly alive. The war had created countless wounded, countless sufferers who would welcome any relief from their pain. The mendicants would find them all, in time. They had eternity to complete their work, and the patience of metal itself. The flesh would fail, as flesh always did, but iron endured forever, and those who embraced it would endure as well, perfect and peaceful and utterly empty of everything that had once made them human. As the procession disappeared over the next hill, the abandoned village settled into a new kind of silence, broken only by the soft clicking of metal parts, as the last few transformed animals went about their business with mechanical purpose. The place had become a monument to transformation, a testament to the mercy of the Iron Saints who offered salvation to all who suffered in flesh. The sun continued its climb across the smoke-darkened sky, but in St. Arasmus village, time had stopped mattering in any human sense. There was only the eternal now of iron, the perfect moment of transformation extended forever, a gift that could never be returned. The road stretched on toward the next village, and the next, and the next, each one waiting for its own blessing, its own moment of transformation when the weakness of flesh would be replaced by the strength of metal, and the chaos of human thought would give way to the perfect order of the Iron Brotherhood's design. The bell tolled on, patient and eternal, calling to all who would listen, and in the growing ranks of the Iron Blessed, there was no longer any question of whether to answer that call. There was only the certainty of mettle, the peace of transformation, and the knowledge that they were part of something greater than themselves, something that would endure long after the last flesh had failed and the world itself had forgotten what it meant to be truly alive. The war would continue as wars always did, but for the Iron Blessed, it had already ended. They had found peace in the only way peace could ever truly be found, by abandoning everything that made peace necessary in the first place. They were beyond conflict now, beyond suffering, beyond the terrible burden of individual will. They were perfect, and perfection, once achieved, could never be lost. The mendicants had been walking for 3 days when they crested the hill overlooking Milbrook. Below them, the village sprawled across the valley floor like a wounded animal, its buildings shattered by artillery fire, its streets littered with debris and worse things. Smoke rose from a dozen fires, and even from this distance, the sound of weeping carried on the wind. Brother Matthias paused at the head of the procession, his masked face turning to survey the devastation with professional interest. Behind him, the iron-blessed villagers from St. Arasmus stood in perfect formation, their breathing synchronized, their metal parts gleaming in the afternoon sun. They showed no fatigue from the journey, no emotion at the sight of fresh suffering. They were beyond such concerns now. Another harvest awaits, Brother Matthias murmured to his fellow mendicants. The iron hungers for new flesh to remember. The great bell wagon rolled forward, its massive wheels crushing wildflowers beneath their weight. As it descended toward the village, its bell began to toll again, that deep, resonant note that seemed to vibrate through bone and marrow. In Milbrook, people looked up from their misery, drawn by a sound they did not yet understand but that called to something deep within their pain. A young soldier, his legs mangled by a mortar blast, dragged himself to his window to see what was approaching. His eyes, still bright with fever, widened as he saw the procession. The robed figures with their terrible masks, the wagon that seemed to dwarf the buildings around it, and strangest of all, the perfect formation of people who walked behind it, moving with a grace that no human should possess. "Help," he called weakly, though he was not sure if he was asking for aid or warning his neighbors to flee. The distinction seemed unimportant as the bell's voice washed over him, filling his mind with a strange peace that made the pain in his shattered legs feel distant and unreal. Brother Matthias entered the village square with the measured pace of a man who had performed this ritual countless times before. His assistants began to unload their equipment, the cauldrons with their serpentine tubes, the boxes of iron plates that seemed to whisper when the wind passed over them, the braziers that would burn with flames the color of old blood. "We bring the mercy of the Iron Saints," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "Those who suffer in flesh may find peace in metal." The villagers emerged from their hiding places slowly, drawn by curiosity and the desperate hope that comes to those who have nothing left to lose. They were a pathetic sight. Burned, broken, half dead from wounds and disease. The war had been particularly cruel to Milbrook, which sat astride a strategic crossroads that had changed hands 6 times in the past month. An old woman hobbled forward, supported by a makeshift crutch. Half her face had been seared away by phosphorus, leaving exposed bone that gleamed white in the daylight. She looked up at Brother Matthias with her remaining eye, and in that gaze was a plea that went beyond words. "Can you truly help us?" she asked, her voice a rasp that spoke of a throat damaged by poison gas. In response, Brother Matthias gestured to the iron-blessed from St. Arasmus. They stepped forward as one, their movements fluid and perfect. The woman who had lost her legs now walked on limbs of gleaming steel that clicked against the cobblestones with mechanical precision. The baker displayed hands of articulated metal that opened and closed with inhuman grace. Each bore the marks of their transformation proudly. The iron plates nestled against their flesh like medals of honor. "Behold," Brother Matthias said, "the blessed of iron. They know no pain, no fear, no weakness of the flesh. They have found peace eternal." The old woman reached out with a trembling hand to touch one of the metal limbs. The surface was warm, almost alive, and she could feel a subtle vibration that spoke of mechanisms working beneath the skin. There was no revulsion in her touch, only wonder and desperate hope. "What must I do?" she whispered. The transformation began immediately. Brother Matthias produced an iron plate larger than any he had used before, its surface covered with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. As he pressed it against the woman's ruined face, her scream of agony was brief, quickly replaced by an expression of profound relief. The iron spread like living tissue, covering the exposed bone and damaged flesh with a surface that gleamed like polished silver. Where her missing eye had been, a perfect sphere of dark metal took its place, reflecting the world with crystal clarity. Her ruined throat was lined with delicate mechanisms that allowed her voice to emerge clear and strong, though it now carried an odd harmonic quality that made it almost musical. "I remember," she said, her new voice ringing across the square. "I remember what it was to be whole." The other villagers pressed forward, their fear overcome by the promise of relief from their suffering. The mendicants moved among them with practiced efficiency, examining wounds, selecting the appropriate iron plates, ladling out portions of the gray soup that steamed in the afternoon air. Young Thomas, barely 16 and already bearing the scars of 3 battles, accepted his portion with hands that shook from shell shock. The soup was warm and tasted of copper and strange spices that made his tongue tingle. Almost immediately, the constant tremor that had plagued him since the bombardment began to subside. When he looked down at his hands, he saw thin silver threads spreading beneath his skin, connecting to small iron plates that had appeared on his wrists. His fingers moved with new precision, the involuntary trembling replaced by perfect control. For the first time in weeks, he felt truly calm. "The iron remembers what flesh forgets," one of the mendicants told him, the voice muffled by the plague mask but carrying an odd warmth. "It holds no terror, knows no doubt." Thomas nodded, understanding flooding through him like a warm tide. The fear that had dominated his thoughts since the first shells fell was fading, replaced by a sense of purpose he had never known before. He was becoming something greater, something that would never again know the weakness that had made him cower in terror while his friends died around him. As the afternoon wore on, more and more villagers underwent their transformations. The bell's voice provided a constant backdrop, its deep tones seeming to resonate through the very earth itself. With each toll, the iron plates grew warmer, the silver threads beneath the skin pulsed brighter, and the barrier between individual consciousness and the greater purpose grew thinner. Margaret, the village healer, had been one of the last to approach. She had spent her life tending to the wounded, and some part of her professional instinct recognized that what she was witnessing was not healing in any traditional sense, but her own wounds were too severe to ignore. The shrapnel had torn through her abdomen, and despite her knowledge of herbs and poultices, she could feel the infection spreading through her body like slow fire. When her turn came, the mendicant who attended her was different from the others. Smaller, more delicate in movement, with a voice that carried undertones of youth despite the muffling effect of the mask. "You have knowledge of the healing arts," the figure said, not quite a question. Margaret nodded weakly. "I have tended the sick since I was old enough to hold a needle." "Then you understand that some cures require sacrifice. The flesh must die so that something greater may be born." The iron plate they used for Margaret was the largest yet, a complex piece that covered most of her torso. As it sank into her flesh, she felt her damaged organs being replaced by something else. something that pumped and flowed and processed but was not quite alive in any sense she understood. Her medical knowledge told her she should be dead. No human could survive having their vital organs replaced by metal mechanisms. But as she sat up, feeling stronger than she had in months, she realized that death might be precisely what had occurred. She was no longer quite human, and therefore no longer subject to human limitations. "I understand," she said, her voice now carrying the same harmonic quality that marked all the transformed. "The flesh is weakness. The iron is strength." Night fell over Milbrook, but the work continued by the light of the braziers that burned with flames the color of old blood. The transformed villagers knelt before the great bell wagon in perfect rows, their breathing synchronized, their heartbeats falling into rhythm with the bell's deep voice. Brother Matthias stood atop the wagon, his masked face turning to survey the orderly ranks below. Where once there had been chaos and suffering, now there was perfect order. The Iron-Blessed showed no fatigue, no pain, no confusion. They had found their place in the greater design, and they were content. "Tomorrow," he announced, "we journey to St. Aldrich's Crossing, and you, the Blessed of Iron, shall help us bring salvation to all who suffer in flesh." The assembled villagers responded in perfect unison, their voices blending into a single harmonic tone that resonated with the bell's voice. Among them, Margaret felt no sorrow at leaving the place where she had been born and raised. Those attachments belonged to her former self, the weak thing of flesh and blood that had died on the operating table of transformation. She was part of something greater now, part of the Iron Brotherhood that would spread across the world like a healing tide, bringing peace to all who suffered in the weakness of flesh. The prospect filled her with a satisfaction deeper than anything she had known in her former life. As the stars wheeled overhead, the mendicants made their preparations for the next day's journey. The cauldrons were cleaned and packed, the remaining iron plates carefully stored, the braziers banked to glowing coals. Everything was done with the mechanical precision that marked the transformed, each action flowing seamlessly into the next. The bell continued to toll throughout the night, its voice carrying across the empty countryside toward distant villages where other sufferers waited unknowingly for their own transformation. With each note, the iron plates grafted into flesh grew slightly warmer, and their bearers felt their old selves fading a little more. By dawn, Milbrook had become another monument to the mercy of the Iron Saints. The village still stood, but it was no longer quite a place where humans lived. Instead, it housed something new, something that served a purpose beyond individual need or desire. The procession formed up as the sun crested the horizon, its light glinting off the metal parts that adorned the growing ranks of the Iron-Blessed. They moved with perfect coordination, their footsteps falling in rhythm with the bell's patient voice. Brother Matthias consulted his map, marking Milbrook with another iron pin. The pins were spreading across the countryside like a disease, marking the places where humanity had been offered the gift of transformation and had accepted it gladly. Soon, the entire region would be blessed, and then the blessing would spread beyond, until every last pocket of flesh had been elevated to the perfection of iron. The road stretched ahead, winding through devastated countryside toward the next settlement. The war had left countless candidates for transformation, broken people who would welcome any relief from their suffering. The mendicants would find them all, in time. They had eternity to complete their work, and the patience of metal itself. As the procession disappeared over the next hill, Milbrook settled into its new silence, broken only by the soft clicking of metal parts and the distant tolling of the bell. The place had been transformed, elevated beyond the weakness of flesh to something pure and perfect and utterly without the chaos of individual will. The sun climbed higher, but in Milbrook, time had ceased to matter in any human sense. There was only the eternal now of iron, the perfect moment of transformation extended forever, a gift that could never be returned and would never be lost. The bell tolled on, calling to all who would listen, promising peace to those who suffered in flesh and offering transformation to any willing to abandon the terrible burden of being truly alive. The sound carried across the empty fields, reaching distant villages where people paused in their misery and turned towards something they did not yet understand, but that called to the deepest part of their suffering. They would learn, in time. They would all learn what it meant to be blessed by the Iron Saints, to trade the weakness of flesh for the strength of metal, to find peace in the only way peace could ever truly be found. The procession moved on, carrying its gift of transformation to the next village, and the next, and the next, each one a step closer to the day when the entire world would know the perfect order of iron, and the last vestiges of chaotic humanity would be nothing more than a fading memory. In the growing ranks of the Iron Blessed, there was no longer any question of whether this was right or wrong. Such concerns belonged to the flesh, and they had moved beyond flesh into something greater. They were the future, the evolution of mankind into perfection, and perfection, once achieved, could never be lost. The fourth day brought them to St. Aldrich's crossing, where the river ran red with more than just the setting sun's reflection. The bridge had been destroyed weeks ago, its ancient stones scattered like broken teeth along the muddy banks. On the far side, the spires of New Antioch rose through the smoke like accusing fingers, their stained glass windows dark and lifeless. Brother Matthias stood at the water's edge, his masked face turned toward the ruined city. Behind him, the Iron Blessed from 3 villages now formed perfect ranks, their breathing synchronized, their metal parts gleaming in the fading light. The great bell wagon dominated the scene, its brass tubes coiling like serpents around its massive frame. "Here," he said to his fellow mendicants, "we will establish our greatest work. The city hungers for transformation, and we shall feed it well." The crossing was shallow at this season, the water barely reaching a man's waist, but the current was strong and the bottom treacherous with submerged debris. A wounded soldier had tried to ford it the previous day and now lay tangled in the reeds, his body bloated and pale, one arm reaching toward the far shore in eternal supplication. The first of the Iron Blessed entered the water without hesitation, their metal limbs cut through the current with mechanical precision, their movements unaffected by the cold or the pull of the flow. They formed a living bridge, each one taking position to guide those who followed, their bodies becoming stepping stones for the advance. Margaret, her torso gleaming with iron plates, took her position in the middle of the current. The water swirled around her waist, but she felt no chill, no discomfort. Her transformed organs regulated her temperature with perfect efficiency, and the metal components of her body were impervious to rust or corrosion. She was beyond such mortal concerns now. Young Thomas waded in beside her, his hands steady despite the rushing water. The silver threads beneath his skin pulsed with each toll of the great bell, and he felt his connection to the Iron Brotherhood growing stronger with every step. He was no longer the frightened boy who had cowered in trenches while shells fell around him. He was something greater, something that knew no fear. One by one, the mendicants crossed, their robes billowing in the water, their masks reflecting the dying light like mirrors. They carried their equipment with reverent care, the cauldrons that would soon steam with gray soup, the boxes of iron plates that whispered their secrets to the wind, the braziers that would burn with flames the color of old blood. The great bell wagon came last, its massive wheels crushing the rocky bottom as it rolled through the ford. The water reached almost to its axles, but the vehicle moved with inexorable purpose, driven by mechanisms that never tired, never faltered, never doubted their path. On the far shore, the ruins of St. Aldrich's crossing stretched before them like an open wound. The village had been beautiful once, its streets lined with flowering trees, its houses built from local stone that gleamed gold in sunlight. Now it was a crater-pocked wasteland where shadows moved between the rubble and the air itself seemed thick with despair. The survivors emerged from their hiding places slowly, drawn by the sound of the bell and the promise it carried. They were fewer than in the other villages, but their wounds were deeper, their suffering more profound. These were people who had seen the worst the war could offer and somehow found the strength to continue breathing, though breathing itself had become an act of defiance. Brother Matthias surveyed them with professional interest. A man whose face had been melted by chemical weapons crawled forward on his belly, his features a ruin of twisted flesh and exposed bone. A young woman clutched the remains of her infant child, refusing to acknowledge that death had claimed it weeks ago. An elderly priest knelt in the rubble of his church, his lips moving in prayers to gods who had long since turned away. "Behold," Brother Matthias announced, his voice carrying clearly across the devastated square, "the mercy of the Iron Saints. Those who suffer in flesh may find peace in metal." The man with the melted face looked up with eyes that wept tears of pus and blood. "What peace can there be for the damned?" he asked, his voice a whisper that spoke of a throat burned by poison gas. In response, Brother Matthias gestured to the iron blessed from the previous villages. They stepped forward as one, their movements fluid and perfect. The old woman from Milbrook displayed her face of gleaming metal, her mechanical eye reflecting the world with crystal clarity. The young soldier from St. Arasmus showed his legs of articulated steel, walking with a grace no human could achieve. "Behold the blessed of iron," Brother Matthias said. "They know no pain, no fear, no weakness of the flesh. Death has no dominion over them, for they have transcended the limitations of mortality." The young woman with the dead child looked up, hope flickering in her eyes like a candle in a hurricane. "Can you bring back the dead?" she asked, her voice breaking on the words. "We can give the dead new purpose," Brother Matthias replied. "The iron remembers what flesh forgets. Even death is but another transformation to be overcome." He gestured to one of his assistants, who approached with a box lined in black silk. Inside lay iron plates unlike any they had used before, their surfaces covered with symbols that seemed to move and shift when viewed directly. These were the plates reserved for the most profound transformations, the ones that could bridge the gap between life and death. The woman surrendered her child willingly, laying the small corpse on the examination table that the mendicants had erected in the square. The infant had been dead for weeks, its tiny body preserved only by the cold and the strange properties of the air itself. Its eyes were clouded, its skin mottled, but there was still something recognizably human about it. Brother Matthias selected a plate no larger than a coin and pressed it against the child's chest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then thin lines of silver began to spread outward from the point of contact, racing through the tiny body like veins of liquid metal. The clouded eyes cleared, becoming perfect spheres of dark iron that reflected the world with inhuman clarity. The child sat up with movements that were too precise, too controlled for something so young. When it spoke, its voice carried the harmonic quality that marked all the transformed, but it was pitched higher, more musical than the others. "Mother," it said, reaching out with fingers that clicked softly as they moved. "I remember you." The woman wept as she gathered the transformed child to her chest, feeling the warmth of the iron plates beneath its skin. This was not resurrection in any traditional sense. The thing that looked like her child was something new, something that had never quite been alive in the way humans understood life. But it was whole, and it was hers, and it would never again know the pain of hunger or cold or fear. "Thank you," she whispered, her tears falling onto the metal surface of her child's face where they beaded like mercury before rolling away. The transformation of St. Aldrich's crossing proceeded through the night, lit by the flames of braziers that burned with colors that had no names. The Iron Blessed worked alongside the mendicants, their movements coordinated with mechanical precision, their purpose unified beyond the chaos of individual will. The man with the melted face received plates that covered the entire left side of his head. replacing the ruined flesh with a surface that gleamed like polished silver. His new eye was a marvel of engineering, capable of seeing clearly despite the damage to his skull. His voice, when it emerged from the mechanical throat that had replaced his damaged larynx, was clear and strong. The elderly priest presented a more complex challenge. His wounds were not of the flesh, but of the spirit, his faith shattered by the horrors he had witnessed. But the iron had remedies for spiritual suffering as well. The plate they grafted to his forehead was inscribed with symbols that spoke directly to the mind, overriding doubt with certainty, replacing anguish with perfect peace. "I see now," he said, his voice carrying new authority. "The flesh is weak, but the iron is eternal. This is the true message, the final revelation." By dawn, St. Aldrich's Crossing had been transformed into something that was no longer quite a village. The survivors moved with perfect coordination, their breathing synchronized, their heartbeats falling into rhythm with the great bell's voice. They showed no attachment to their former lives, no sorrow at leaving behind the places where they had been born and raised. Brother Matthias stood atop the bell wagon as the sun crested the horizon, his masked face turning to survey the orderly ranks below. 4 villages now marched in his wake, their inhabitants transformed beyond recognition, their humanity traded for something that pulsed with mechanical certainty. The great bell tolled its deep note across the devastated countryside, and in response, the iron-blessed moved as one organism, their footsteps falling in perfect synchronization. The sound of their march was like clockwork made flesh, each step precise, each breath coordinated, each heartbeat synchronized with the rhythm of transformation. But as they crested the hill overlooking the shrine of the martyrs, Brother Matthias felt something he had not experienced in the long years of his calling. The faintest tremor in his gloved hands, a slight hesitation in his measured gait. Below them, the ancient shrine rose from the earth like a bone cathedral, its spires twisted with age and something else, something that made the very air shimmer with wrongness. The shrine had been old when the Hell Gate opened, older than the war, older than memory. Its stones were black with accumulated sorrow, its windows dark as empty sockets. But it was not abandoned. Figures moved between its buttresses, robed forms that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "The starlit cult," one of the younger mendicants whispered, his voice tight with something that might have been fear if such emotions were still available to him. Brother Matthias nodded slowly. He had heard reports, fragments of intelligence gathered from the scattered remnants of the armies that had passed this way. The starlit cult had claimed the shrine months ago, turning it into something that even the war avoided. Entire regiments had vanished in the vicinity, leaving behind only their equipment and strange marks burned into the earth in patterns that hurt to contemplate. The great bell wagon rolled forward nonetheless, its massive wheels crushing wildflowers that grew in colors that had no names. As they descended toward the shrine, the Iron Blessed began to exhibit behaviors they had never shown before. Small twitches appeared in their perfect coordination, tiny hesitations in their synchronized breathing. Margaret felt it first, a sensation she had not experienced since her transformation. The iron plates grafted to her torso began to vibrate with a frequency that set her teeth on edge. The mechanical organs within her chest pumped faster, driven by something that was not quite panic but resembled it closely enough to be disturbing. Young Thomas's silver-threaded hands began to shake, the tremor he had thought banished forever returning with renewed intensity. But this was different from his shell shock. This trembling came from the metal itself, as if the iron that had given him peace was now the source of a new kind of terror. The transformation had promised freedom from fear, but as they approached the shrine, the Iron Blessed discovered that there were fears older and deeper than those that afflicted mere flesh. The metal in their bodies resonated with something in the ancient stones, something that spoke of purposes beyond the simple mercy of the Iron Saints. Brother Matthias raised his hand, and the procession came to a halt at the edge of the shrine's shadow. The silence that fell was not the comfortable quiet of perfect order, but something pregnant with menace. Even the great bell seemed reluctant to toll, its voice muted and discordant when it finally rang. From within the shrine came the sound of chanting, voices raised in harmonies that seemed to originate from somewhere other than human throats. The words were in no language that had ever been spoken by living tongues, yet their meaning was clear enough. They spoke of stars that watched with malevolent intelligence, of geometries that existed beyond the comfortable constraints of 3 dimensions, of transformations that made the Iron Brotherhood's work seem crude and primitive by comparison. A figure emerged from the shrine's main entrance, tall and impossibly thin, wrapped in robes that seemed to be cut from the fabric of night itself. Where its face should have been was a void filled with points of light that moved in patterns too complex for mortal minds to follow without suffering. "Brothers of Iron," the figure spoke, its voice like wind through sepulchres. "You have brought us gifts." Brother Matthias found his voice, though it emerged as a croak from beneath his plague mask. "We are the servants of the Iron Saints. We bring mercy to those who suffer in flesh." The figure tilted its head with interest, and the points of light within its hood shifted in patterns that suggested amusement. "Mercy? How quaint. We offer something far grander. Evolution beyond the crude marriage of flesh and metal. Transformation into something that exists beyond the prison of matter itself." The Iron Blessed began to move without conscious volition, drawn forward by forces they could not comprehend. Their metal parts no longer felt like improvements to their flesh, but like anchors dragging them toward something vast and hungry. The silver threads beneath their skin pulsed with alien rhythms, and their mechanical organs began to function in ways their designers had never intended. Margaret felt her iron torso opening like a flower, revealing mechanisms within that seemed to exist in more dimensions than her mind could process. The sight should have been impossible, but she was no longer entirely subject to the laws that govern normal matter. The transformation had made her something other than human, and now that otherness was being called home to something even more alien. Young Thomas watched in fascination as his hands began to dissolve, not into blood and bone, but into geometric patterns that folded in on themselves until they existed in spaces that had no names. His fear was gone, replaced by a terrible understanding that this had always been the destination, that the Iron Brotherhood had been gathering raw material for purposes they themselves did not comprehend. The mendicants tried to retreat, but found their feet rooted to the earth by iron tendrils that had erupted from the ground itself. Their plague masks began to crack, revealing faces that were no longer entirely human. They had thought themselves the masters of transformation, but now they discovered they had been servants of something far older and more terrible. Brother Matthias felt his own mask splitting along seams he had never noticed before. Beneath it, his face was a maze of metal and void, a fusion of iron and something that came from the spaces between stars. He tried to speak, to command, to assert the authority he had wielded for so long, but the words that emerged were in the same impossible language that echoed from within the shrine. The great bell wagon began to change, its brass tubes writhing like living things, its iron wheels sinking into earth that had become fluid. The bell itself grew larger, its surface inscribed with symbols that shifted and flowed like liquid starlight. When it tolled now, its voice carried harmonics that resonated through dimensions that existed only in the nightmares of mathematicians. The iron blast from the 4 villages found themselves changing again, their careful transformations revealed as mere preparation for this final metamorphosis. They were becoming something that existed partially in the world of matter and partially in realms where geometry had different rules and time moved in directions that had no correspondence with human experience. Petra, the child from St. Arasmus who had been among the first to receive the gift of iron, felt her consciousness expanding beyond the confines of her skull. She could see the shrine not just as it appeared, but as it existed across multiple layers of reality. In some dimensions it was ruins. in others a thriving temple, in still others something that defied description entirely. The understanding came to all of them simultaneously, transmitted through the iron networks that connected their transformed bodies. They had never been saved. They had been harvested. The Iron Saints themselves were servants of entities that regarded the distinction between matter and void as a quaint limitation to be overcome. The figure from the shrine extended arms that ended not in hands but in spaces where hands should have been. Voids that pulled at the iron blessed with gravitational forces that operated on principles unknown to mortal science. One by one, they were drawn forward, their bodies beginning the final transformation that would take them beyond the crude binary of flesh and metal into something that existed in the spaces between thoughts. Brother Matthias felt his consciousness fracturing across multiple planes of existence as he was pulled toward the shrine. Part of him remained aware of his role as leader of the mendicants, while other fragments of his being experienced realities where the war had different outcomes, where the Hellgate had opened in different places, where humanity had chosen different paths toward transcendence. In one reality, he saw clearly what they had become. Harvesters for entities that fed on the moment of transformation itself, on the precise instant when consciousness abandoned its familiar patterns and embraced something utterly alien. The villages they had visited, the people they had transformed, all of it had been orchestrated to create the perfect conditions for this final harvest. The great bell tolled one last time, its voice now carrying frequencies that existed only in the theoretical mathematics of cosmic horror. The sound shattered the last barriers between dimensions, and the shrine revealed its true nature. Not a building at all, but a point where reality had been worn thin by countless transformations. A doorway that led not to salvation but to something vast and patient and utterly inhuman. As the iron-blessed were drawn into the shrine's embrace, their final, coherent thought was the realization that they had been willing participants in their own consumption. They had traded their humanity for iron, and now they were trading their iron existence for something that had no name in any language spoken by beings who still drew breath. The shrine consumed them with the patience of geological time, adding their transformed essence to a collection that spanned centuries. They joined the ranks of countless others who had thought they were choosing transcendence but had instead chosen to become food for things that regarded matter and energy as interchangeable currencies in a cosmic economy beyond human comprehension. The countryside around the shrine fell silent, the wind itself seeming reluctant to disturb the wrongness that hung in the air like fog. The villages they had left behind continued to exist, their remaining inhabitants going through the motions of their mechanical existence, unaware that their puppeteers had themselves been puppets in a game whose rules they had never understood. In the growing darkness, something moved between the shrine's buttresses, preparing for the next harvest, the next group of sufferers who would be offered transformation and would accept it gladly, never suspecting that their salvation was merely the first course in a feast that would span dimensions and consume realities yet to be born. The iron had remembered, just as promised. But what it remembered was not human weakness or mortal pain. It remembered the hunger of things that existed before matter learned to dream, and it served that hunger with the perfect loyalty of metal that had never known the chaos of individual will.